Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5, Flight in Locusts. Let me put our lecture up here. So in this unit, we're going to be talking about motor units. We're moving into muscles and central pattern generators that can create patterned muscle output. And then talk a little bit about proprioceptive and exteroceptive feedback, which if you haven't heard those terms, you'll be more familiar with them soon. So the first video, we're going to talk about locust flight and muscle morphology, and then move into the central pattern generators, and finally end on the sensory feedbacks that play into the system. So we'll start with desert locusts, which are normally solitary, and when they're in their solitary phase, this is when they are, I guess, least problematic for society. But they become gregarious and highly mobile when conditions are really good for 1 to 2 years. So they're most commonly known in Africa. They have spread to other areas as well with people's movement. But when it rains, a lot of rain, like monsoon kind of rains, for I guess frequent enough in time across a couple of years, that there's a lot of green growth. And when that happens, eggs hatch and the young emerge and eventually become winged and enter into a movement phase. And throughout their whole lifestyle, they consume a lot of high carbohydrate crops. And so they really decimate a lot of the food production in these areas in Africa that end up having outbreaks. They can also move really long distances, which is, I noted here, called an extended foraging movement. It's not really a migration. It's more about going wherever there is food, and you know, they essentially follow chemosensory olfactory cues in order to do that. But to tell us more about that, we'll listen to this BBC video. Again, if I can get it to play. Oh man. This always happens. Keynote. There we go. Got it. We'll turn it up.
There is no other species on the planet that responds as quickly and as dramatically to good times as the desert locust. Eggs that have remained in the ground for 20 years begin to hatch. The young locusts are known as hoppers, for at this stage they're flightless. They find new feeding grounds by following the smell of sprouting grass. Normally, it takes 4 weeks for hoppers to become adults, but when the conditions are right, as now, their development switches to the fast track. As the vegetation in one place begins to run out, the winged adults release pheromones, scent messages, which tell others in the group that they must move on. And when groups merge, they form a swarm. An adult locust eats its entire body weight every day, and a whole swarm can consume literally hundreds of tons of vegetation. They have to keep on moving. The swarm travels with the wind. It's the most energy-saving way of flying. For following the flow of wind means that they're always heading toward areas of low pressure, places where wind meets rain and vegetation starts to grow. As they fly, swarms join up with other swarms to form gigantic plagues several billion strong and as much as 40 miles wide. They will consume every edible thing that lies in their path. This is one of planet Earth's greatest spectacles. It's rarely seen on this scale, and it won't last long. Once the food has gone, the steady roar of a billion beating locust wings will once again be replaced by nothing more than the sound of the desert wind.
Okay, thank you, BB Earth. BBC Earth, BB Earth. Okay, so like locust fly, and they've become a really important model for understanding the control of flight. And any flying animal, just like walking animals and crawling animals and swimming animals, have problems that they encounter during the locomotion. And so for the muscle movement, you have to be able to coordinate movements between pairs of legs or pairs of wings moving together. And in even more complexity, if you have multiple pairs of wings, how they might move at different times relative to each other. Within a given muscle group, you're going to have alternating extensor and flexor muscle contractions. So anytime you're going to move a limb or a wing, then you have essentially the only way that you can move something is to contract a muscle. There's no force when a muscle relaxes and lengthens. So the only way you can generate any power is by shortening the muscle and contracting it. And so the way that you move something in two directions is that you have extensors and flexors that contract in different directions and therefore pull the limb in different directions. So you've got to be able to do that. And obviously when you're contracting one extensor, you have to relax the flexor and vice versa, or else you get problems. Another is that, of course, you don't fly in a vacuum. You're constantly adjusting to internal and external conditions. And so there are what we call proprioceptive feedback, and proprioceptive basically means it's internal cues, and it essentially describes the proprioceptive receptors describe where the body's parts are in space. So like, I don't have to see my hand to know that I'm holding it up behind my head. And the reason that I don't have to see it to know that is because I have proprioceptors that are telling me exactly what each muscle is doing. And then my brain puts that together into a picture of what the body is doing. So these proprioceptive receptors can keep track of muscle performance, and they do that by how much the muscle is stretching, adjustments to interruptions like collisions. We have to have adjustments to energy stores, oxygen availability, lactic acid buildup. Those are going to be different kinds of receptors like chemosensors and whatnot. We're not going to really talk about those today. We're going to talk more about the proprioceptive feedback on muscles. And then you have external feedbacks, exteroceptive, and these are things like wind. Mostly we're going to talk about wind today. That's the big one for flight. Its impact on pitch, roll, and yaw, which we'll review later. And then, of course, you have obstacles and predators that might appear as you're flying and you need to respond to. So these are all possible things that could come up during flight. So studying locust flight has been done for a long time, and it's convenient that a locust, so most insects are like this. There are very simple, I guess, ways that you can induce an insect to behave. And so in this case, we want the locust to fly. And the way that you get a locust to fly in the lab and in the wild the way you get a locust to fly is that you hold it so that its legs are not touching the ground, and then you puff some wind at it. And those two things will cause a locust to start flying. And we'll talk about why that is during this lecture. But what that allows for is that you can study flight, and you can study it in really, complex and intricate ways in the lab. And you can also, use electrodes in the locust while it's flying and actually measure neural output. And these are really amazing things to be able to do in these invertebrates. Then you can vary the conditions, like how much wind, what direction is the wind coming from, what is the locust, how does the muscle system respond if you, do this or that. And so you can learn a lot about how animals adjust neurally and behaviorally to environmental conditions. So this is a system that's still being used today, of course, with fancier equipment. But it was developed by a guy named Don Wilson in the 1970s, who did a lot of the early work on locust flight. He actually died when he was 37 years old. He was kind of an extreme sports guy, and he had a whitewater rafting accident. So he died quite young, but not without making a pretty important contribution to the field already at such a young age. So anyway, this is a picture of his setup, and essentially the locust is kind of attached to a little rod that can detect movement in kind of the X and Y direction. And so you can attach sensors to that, and you can know which way the locust is kind of generating force. So you can know if it's lifting, if it's dropping, if it's moving, in whatever direction. And you orient this moth so that it's facing a wind tunnel. Obviously, you're not going to use very much wind to induce the flight, but you can adjust it however you want to. And then you can have EKG system set up to measure the muscle activity, and people have now done electrodes into specific neurons while they're in these flight tunnels, which is really amazing. Okay, so we're going to start with locust wing morphology, and essentially they have two pairs of wings that attach to the thorax. So it's interesting, birds and bats, their wings are actually modified limbs, but that's not true in insects. So they evolved an entirely new structure as a wing. And you can see in the pictures here that they have two sets. So they have kind of a small forewing and then a larger hind wing. And during flight, those two wings beat slightly out of phase with each other, especially on the downstroke, where the hind wing goes down first and then the forewing goes down second. And they both come up slightly different timing, but much closer in time than when they go down. Interestingly, if a locust flies, its wings beat at a really steady rate. So 20 kilohertz, oftentimes despite environmental conditions. So what that tells us is that they basically don't use beat frequency or how fast they're beating the wings in order to adjust. Instead, they use, they adjust how they kind of twist the wings to adjust to environmental abnormalities and to steer and turn and all that kind of stuff. Finally, they're really efficient flyers. So because of how flexible their wings are and that they can bend them and fold them in intricate ways during flight, this has led to a really efficient flight, despite the fact that insects overall are actually not very efficient flyers because they're so small. But in any case, they also have kind of complex, I'm sure you guys have all looked up close, I hope anyway, at an insect's wing before, but they have really intricate vein structures. And, it's not that that's delivering any nutrients to the wing. The wing's like a fingernail or something, it's a dead structure. But it has the morphology, the structure of those veins are really important for flight efficiency, interestingly enough. And a lot of people, engineers who study the wings of insects in order to try to develop better you know, like miniature drones and stuff, have learned that you can't just take away the veins without losing a lot of the efficiency of flight. I don't know why. Okay, gonna get there eventually. Okay, so of course you need to have muscles in order to move the wings. And this is a picture of a dragonfly, but in insects, there's basically two types of flight muscles. You have synchronous flight muscles, which basically for every motor neuron impulse, you get one wing. There's also asynchronous, where the wing beats much faster. So things like bees and flies and things that hover more, they're using asynchronous muscles. But in any case, in the locust, each wing has 4 depressor, the downstroke. So that's going to be the one that creates the lift and elevates the animal in the air. 4 depressor muscles and 6 elevator muscles. And the depressors include both longitudinal muscles that run along the length of the body. So in the bottom picture there of the bee or the fly or whatever that is there, you can see a longitudinal muscle that runs along the length of the thorax, and then a vertical muscle that runs up and down. And so in the picture in the bigger picture, you can see that those are the vertical muscles that they're showing, where when the elevator muscle contracts, it pulls the wings up. And then when the depressor muscle contracts, it pulls them back down. And that's because they're attached to different, the top or the bottom of the wing. And so one of them, when it contracts, will pull the bottom down. One of them, when it contracts, will pull the top up. And so you can get different movements on those wings. Okay, so here's just a picture showing that these are synchronous muscles. So more or less one. Sometimes there can be multiple impulses from the motor neuron, but on average, you'll see that there's essentially for every pulse, you'll get a full wing beat. And so this is showing the electrical pulse in the motor neuron here, and then the muscle movement in the wing here. Okay, the muscle goes up and then down, and full contraction. And then it's also showing the calcium pulse inside the muscle. So we're not going to go over how muscles contract, but you have your actin and myosin filaments inside of the muscle. Insect muscle is the same as skeletal muscle in us. And the muscle is essentially induced to start contracting, and those 2 myosin and actin filaments walk down each other through protein action that costs a lot of ATP, and that movement is induced by calcium. And so you can see here that calcium pulse is following the impulse very slightly in time. So you get the motor neuron fires first, and then you get the calcium influx inside the muscle, and then you get the contraction, all kind of happening in order. So here's just a timing of the forewing and the hind wing is essentially what this is showing. And basically the hind wing is happening a little bit earlier than the forewing. So in the bottom in panel B down here, you can see that the hind wing, so if you look at this line is given a reference point, you can see that the hind wing here and here is starting to contract. Those depressor muscles are contracting slightly before the forewing depressor muscles, but in general, they're both contracting at about the same time. So you get the wings coming down and creating a lift, and then they'll start to move back up when the elevator muscles contract here. And you can see they're a little bit more similar in the timing of when the 2 wings contract. So you need to have patterned motor outputs from the neurons in order to control this highly rhythmic behavior. And that's what we're going to move to next, is how rhythmic behavior like flying or walking is generated in the first place. And then in the last video, we'll talk about how that rhythmic behavior can then be altered when you have something happen that's unexpected in the system. Okay, so let me see if I can get out of this here.